The proposals to ban tobacco ingredients through the World Health Organization, it's upset quite a few COMESA member states. Why the resistance?
Thank you, Loratu, for having me here and to talk about this subject. There is resistance simply because there are many reasons for resistance. And COMESA has shown that they are willing to stand up for the people that they represent. And what the Health Organization is trying to do through the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is nonsensical. It is not thought through at all. It is unreasonable, and it has no health benefit on top of all of that.
Okay, just explain to us why it has no health benefit, because that's really the essence of the measures being taken by the World Health Organization.
About half of the cigarettes consumed in the world is traditional blended cigarettes, as you rightly said. That means that the other half is what we call Virginia cigarettes. Now, they want to ban the ingredients in blended cigarettes, which means basically the end of the manufacturing of blended cigarettes. And why we say there is no health benefit is because smokers will still have a choice. If they can't smoke blended cigarettes, some of them might stop smoking, but most of them probably will not. They will choose other products, other tobacco products, of which there are many. And that's why we say there is no definite health benefit in this, and that's why we say it's nonsensical.
So in terms of the measures to be taken, right now you want to sit in this coming summit concerning this Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But ultimately, if you don't get any compromises, there is the option as COMESA to form a bloc that will ultimately vote no against it. But is that a sufficient enough bloc to block the proposed legislation or international regulation?
What you say is actually very important. You say we sit in the summit where they want to push these guidelines through. And that is the sadness of the story, that we actually do not sit there. We are the party that will be at loss here, and we do not get to sit there. We're not allowed. We do not have a voice. We have not been asked. And this is millions of tobacco farmers and people in rural areas in Africa.
But ultimately you have a voice through the COMESA member states who will be there, who are supporting the lobby.
Absolutely. That's why we worked with COMESA. And let us commend COMESA here. You know, people might not know, but COMESA is the first trade bloc in the world, up to date, who stood up for their people. In COMESA, 19 countries might not sound a lot, but they represent more than 400 million people. And COMESA had the guts to stand up and say to the World Health Organization, look, what you are doing is going to hurt our people, and we're not going to allow it. And we're going to stand up against it and talk to us before you want to go further with this.
We know that the cultivation of leaf processing, production, all of that is the hallmark of Zimbabwe's agricultural industry, Malawi's agricultural industry, and it's quite prevalent in countries like Kenya and Tanzania. Could you just give us a perspective of how important tobacco is in the agricultural mix of Africa and what we're exporting internationally?
If you talk Africa, you can in the same breath talk tobacco. And let's give a few examples. If you talk Malawi, 200 million kilograms of burley tobacco, biggest burley tobacco producer in the world. 7 out of 10 people in Malawi are involved in tobacco growing. All of that is exported for foreign exchange. 70% of the country's foreign exchange earnings. No small feat for tobacco. In Mozambique, we have 100,000 farmers growing burley tobacco. In Zambia, it's more than 3% of the GDP. In Tanzania, 65 million kilograms, biggest exporter after gold in Tanzania, 65 million US dollars. In Zimbabwe, tobacco is the main drive behind the resurgence in agriculture. 55,000 new small farmers. Crop doubled from last year to this year. And so we can continue if you look at countries like Kenya, Uganda, and even South Africa is an important producer of tobacco.
Frank, let's bring it to the conversation. Yeah. It seems like a moral dilemma. For the World Health Organization, it's pursuing this overarching agenda of trying to get people to smoke less and look after themselves. It's a health benefit issue for which they have a mandate and a responsibility. The case that's being argued here is an economic case, is that you will decimate an industry that provides a livelihood for almost 500,000 people across Africa, which is something to consider. So it's almost like morality versus pragmatism here, and which is going to win at the end of the day.
And I think it's a more complex issue than we have time to discuss here, but What there are a number of substances that are mixed into cigarettes to make them more attractive. Some of these things can be chemical, some of these things can be natural. Now, I think the industry is happy with removing the chemical substances, as far as I understood, vanilla flavoring and strawberry and whatever it may be, to make it more appealing. But what has happened here, they've also banned other varieties of tobacco entering a cigarette, of which Africa and the parts you have mentioned are large growers. And the big thing about agriculture is it's a large employer of low-skilled people. And although their long-term plan proposed was, maybe change your crop from tobacco to something else, that requires a hell of a lot of costs and other things to take place before it happens. So if I'm in tobacco, I know who buys my tobacco, I know who my suppliers are of my seeds, I know where my product goes. If I turn to sugarcane, I have to find a buyer, I have to find a market, I have to get it out of here. All those costs are then borne by, so you will have a large negative impact on African.
Do you think that the World Health Organization, Francois van Merwe, is being very one-dimensional, having tunnel vision, in the sense that they're also proposing, well, you know what, this is not viable, look at alternative livelihoods?
Lerato, you've said it. It is very unfortunate to confirm that an agency of the United Nations is one-dimensional, unilateral, exclusive, and they decide well beyond the health agenda. And let me just say this for the viewers out there. Even tobacco farmers realize that the product they produce cause harm to people's health. No quibbles with that, no problem. Therefore, the tobacco sector needs to be regulated. But do it in a balanced way so that you can achieve the noble health objectives on the one hand, and on the other hand, allow a sector to contribute to continents and to countries and to families and send kids to school, and in rural areas make a living. So that's unfortunately, and the main reason for this, Lerato, is because the World Health Organization does not engage with the tobacco sector. How can you regulate a sector without knowing them, without understanding them, and without involving them? And that's why we say enough is enough, to hear and no further. If you want to regulate us, let's talk about the balance between health, as you rightly said, and the trade issues, the economic issues, the jobs, the taxes, and all those issues.
Okay, let's take emotion out of it and let's talk about the viability of the sector going forward. Because just looking at the Zimbabwean case in particular, although crop yields have been better and the output has been higher this last season, it's still a function of smallholder farmers. So if we're talking about a viable sector going forward, it doesn't really have a lot of potential because people are producing small volumes on small plots of land. We need to create economies of scale in Africa across the agricultural space to really make a difference. But if we're doing it in this way, then we don't really have a very strong argument for trade at the end of the day. And the World Health Organization could use that as a leverage.
Lerato, yes, you might find it interesting that that is not only a phenomenon in Africa, the small scale, and you're absolutely correct. Obviously, farmers need to grow to become semi-commercial, although even on a small scale. But more than 70–80% of the world's tobacco production is produced on a small scale. A country like Brazil, farmers grow between 2 and 3 and 5 hectares of tobacco. China is all small scale. In Europe, there are small growers. So Africa is not the exception. And the important thing here is also in Africa that tobacco is not grown on its own in most cases. It is grown alongside food crops, where the food crops feed the family and the tobacco produces the cash to buy the goods, to send the kids to school, to buy the clothes, and all those things. So yes, we always strive to get farmers to become a little bit more commercial, a little bit more better, and everybody strives to become better. The reality is the most of the tobacco in the world is produced by smaller tobacco farmers.
Okay, aside from what's happening at the World Health Organization level, what needs to be done to make the sector a little bit more vibrant? In Malawi, I know that there's been the fertilizer subsidy scheme introduced by the government, and where they also market the product on behalf of the farmer. It's not happening across all of Africa, and this is where the small-scale farmers become quite vulnerable.
Lorato, it has become politically the right thing in the world to talk against tobacco, to denormalize tobacco. And that is the first thing that must change. In the eyes of society, in the eyes of governments, and this is unfortunately driven by the World Health Organization, to try and denormalize tobacco. Even tobacco farmers start talking about, should I continue, should I not? Because it's this thing hanging over you. So once you denormalize that is the direction you go. If you treat tobacco as a normal crop, like all other crops, like it is, there's a good market, there's a stable market, there's a good demand. It is one of the most stable crops in the world. Farmers know when they plant tobacco that they will have a market at a reasonable price for that. And once we start normalizing tobacco again, in the eyes of society, in the eyes of governments, and once we get agriculture ministers to stand up for tobacco and look after tobacco farmers, there are huge opportunities to reach the objectives that you have just mentioned. But health ministries are normally allowed to run tobacco and decide tobacco and do everything with tobacco. And that is wrong, it is not reasonable, it is nonsensical, and we have to stand up against it.
Interesting phenomenon when we deal with regulation and all these ethical issues. Despite a ban on advertising, despite tighter regulations, some of the more profitable listed companies internationally, certainly on the JSE, are tobacco companies. It says something about human nature and probably our willingness to rebel. But it also says this is not an industry you can just kill off through a variety of health interventions. So what is the common ground or the middle ground in terms of health concerns, but also in terms of growing the sector, because it seems to be a potentially profitable farming enterprise?
And precisely because it's a small holding, it's valuable, because I, as an average rural farmer, don't have much land, but I can still make a profit with a crop like tobacco. But I think what's more important here as well is they've obviously tried from the demand side to tell us it's not good for us, but there's one thing that comes out in a democracy, and that is people like free choice. I like to choose whether I want a beer on the weekend or a cigarette. And I think that you're not going to stop the industry by quelling demand on fears of health issues. It's easy to ring fence an industry, though, because everyone must come to the same market. And if I stop the industry, I can stop the supply of tobacco, and I can stop whatever I think is happening to that tobacco.
Okay, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely correct. One of the most serious unintended consequences of everything the World Health Organization has done so far is the establishment, the growth of a black market, an illicit trade. And that's what happens if you overregulate, if you overtax, if you go too far. If you make regulations so strict, you create the opportunity for criminal elements who manufacture products who don't comply with regulation. You get your normal players who comply, and that is phenomenal. Between 8 and 12% of the total world market today is black market, illicit. Governments lose billions. In South Africa, to give you an example, the illicit market is already 25%. Not many companies have a 25% market share. Government in South Africa loses 2.5 billion rand in unpaid taxes, and the industry loses 2.5 billion. It's 5 billion out of our economy. How many houses can you build with that? How many roads? How many schools? All those things. And that is the unintended consequences of over-regulation of the tobacco sector.
Thank you so much for joining us, Francois van der Merwe, who's the chair of the International Tobacco Farmers Association.